Today's episode, I talked to Dr. Max Gulhane. Max is a medical doctor, GP registrar, and decentralized health educator. He believes strongly in giving his patients the tools they need to live their most optimal, healthy life using principles of circadian and quantum biology, ancestral diets, and regenerative farming. And Max is really one of the thought leaders here in Australia around the ancestral health and circadian biology movement, as well as discussions around regenerative agriculture. So very excited to be able to talk to him. We dive into all sorts of topics around nutrition and circadian biology particularly, and I get to pick his brain a little bit about some of the nuances in that space. So it's a great episode. I think you get a lot of great information from it. And of course, this podcast is brought to you by Vital Origin, Australia's best and most ethical animal-based supplement company here. And for all of our listeners, you can use the code SOURCE10 at checkout to get 10% off anything in store. Whatever platform you're listening to us, please make sure you like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel, and even leave us a comment or review. All right, well, I hope you enjoy this episode with Dr. Max Gulhane. Welcome to the Health from the Source podcast, where we're dedicated to educating people about health, ancestral nose-to-tail nutrition, regenerative agriculture, and the interplay between environment, health, and sustainability. All right, Max, welcome to the show. Thank you for taking the time to come on to our new podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Pleasure. So as I mentioned, I've been following your work for quite some time, so quite excited to finally be able to have a talk with you and get into quite a lot of different topics. But before we jump into some of those, it's always good to get a bit of your background. Some of our listeners might not know your background, so it'd be great to learn a little bit more about how you got into medicine and how you sort of eventually got into this whole ancestral animal-based approach and regenerative agriculture. So I'll hand it off to you.
Yeah, so I'm a conventionally trained doctor. So I've done a Bachelor of Science with clinical research, benchside research. I've done an MD degree and a public health degree down in the University of Melbourne. And I was learning this clinical medicine and how to essentially diagnose and treat disease. But nothing in my medical education set me up for questions of health prevention and health optimization. And perhaps I wouldn't have been interested or gone down this road if I hadn't become a patient myself. And for me, that was essentially encounter with the dermatology profession and specialty, because I had bad acne. And this was a problem that I developed later in life, in my late teens, early 20s. And it was persistent, and it was unsightly, it was annoying, it was uncomfortable. And I had contact with GPs, and then eventually was referred and prescribed by dermatologists just a succession of medications. And these medications, people who've had acne in the past might be familiar with, things like topical antibiotics, things like topical benzoyl peroxide, topical retinoids, and then kind of an escalating dose of or increasing heaviness of medications to oral antibiotics, which are obviously medications that we use for infection generally, and then a much heavier medication called isotretinoin. So this approach, this clinical approach to, it's not working, so let's just continue to either add another agent or escalate the dose of the agent that we're using. It's consistent in medicine across specialties, and the approach is fundamentally ignorant of, or ignoring the fact that there's a cause for the disease process, that this pharmaceutical medication or surgery is not addressing the underlying cause. The reason why it became a problem, or it is a problem for me, and it was a problem for me, and it is a problem for anyone, is that these treatments have side effects, and the process is unpleasant. Most people don't want to have an illness and would happily change their lifestyle if they were simply informed about the causes that were kind of precipitating the problem. In my case, it was simply eating a higher carb diet, which later on, having learned what I know now, was essentially a deuterium rich diet. And I had a low solar redox. I had a relatively low vitamin D, and my gut permeability was suffering as a result of those things. And simply, it was a manifestation that the acne on my face was a manifestation of poor gut permeability and an inability to maintain a solid gut barrier, and therefore essentially an intolerance to these type of foods. So the pathway to discovering a decentralized medical approach, a ancestral health approach, was a journey of essentially self education, self discovery, self learning, and self curing. At the same time, or in parallel to my formal clinical education. So I found a YouTube channel called Low Carb Down Under, which maybe your listeners are aware of, which has got a great bunch of talks from doctors who predominantly talking about as the name suggests, low carbohydrate diets, mainly for metabolic diseases like polycystic ovary syndrome, like prediabetes, insulin resistance, diabetes, fatty liver disease, and all the way to type 2 diabetes, type 1 diabetes 2. So it's a very, very great resource, because just like my acne was being provoked by my high carb, seasonally inappropriate diet, essentially the root cause of, or one of the proximate causes of this insulin resistance, obesity epidemic, metabolic disease epidemic that we're collectively facing as a society, also has a contributing factor in a high carb, deuterium rich diet, amongst other things, including light. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that. But
Definitely.
the journey for me was finding that low carb fixed the acne. And at the same time as fixing my skin, it also fixed other vague symptoms that I thought were normal, like bloating, like recurrent viral infections during winter, like coughs, just things that fatigue, things that you're not sure were normal, but you kind of get used to. And I'm sure a lot of people who make these stepwise changes in their lifestyle, they discover as well that they'd be essentially walking with skiing with clouded ski goggles on, and until they take them off and get a new pair, they realize how brilliantly they can see. So eventually that low carb became carnivore, particularly learning about this carnivore approach from figures like Dr. Sean Baker and Dr. Paul Saladino. And then interestingly for me, after about 8 to 10 months of strict carnivore, I started feeling suboptimal again. And around that time, I was continuing to learn. And in this space, it's impossible to get away from, and if you're curious, from Dr. Jack Kruse. And he is basically a controversial, highly intelligent, pioneer of incorporating light as medicine and looking deeper, very, very much deeper than merely diet in terms of the influence on our health. So incorporating the principles that he talks about, which are with respect to specifically light, and temperature to a lesser degree, was a missing piece for my health, and getting me to a stage where reintroducing things like seasonal fruit, cycling in and out of ketosis, depending on the season and the context, was something that I was able to tolerate without bringing back the symptoms that initially precipitated the whole change of diet. So that that journey basically reformulated my thought or priority about holistic health and health optimization, and really made me come around to this idea that really it's our light environment that is the first thing to address on the hierarchy of lifestyle inputs that influence our susceptibility or our likelihood to develop disease. And at the same time, I was a graduated medical school, and I was working. I'd worked in emergency departments. I'd done shift work. I'd done night shift, and found that applying these circadian and light interventions, as well as contextual, very strict strict carnivore, it had a way of basically blunting or mitigating the damaging effect of shift work. So this was all very, very interesting learning for me. And at the beginning of 23, I started my general practice training, because in terms of applying this knowledge to help people in a clinical setting, general practice is the best opportunity for that, because it's a long-term relationship you can form, and you can really better than other specialties. It's not ideal because there's time limits, the way that medicine is set up at the moment, but it's better than many to kind of walk people through the this whole process. And around the end of last year, about a year ago now, I also started my own podcast and went on a kind of an extension of this kind of intellectual journey, which is talking to people like what we're doing right now. And that has had a very beneficial effect of basically accelerating your learning and basically testing your ideas against the best in the world. So that whole aspect of it is been fantastic because it's a way of extending this lifestyle education to people essentially for free, in a way that can assist them without them needing to be sitting in front of me or you or anyone else consulting. And that obviously has a role, but for people who aren't or very motivated and not so far down the road that they need clinical supervision, then it's a fantastic way to scale these types of messages. So part of, and to answer your question, part of, well, one of the heuristics or foundation or approaches that I developed was that of ancestral health. And the word gets kind of bandied around a little bit somewhat these days, but to me, it essentially means understanding the niche, the ecological and evolutionary niche of our species, and simply mimicking or recreating that in order to facilitate optimal health. And that is as simple as, you have a car. If it's a Ferrari, it's designed for a track or a highway or a road. It's not designed for a fire trail or a four-wheel drive track. To use a very basic mechanical analogy, likewise, if you have a Land Cruiser four-wheel drive, don't expect it to be able to do 280 kilometers an hour on the highway, because that's not what it's designed for. So a lot of this journey and this intellectual journey is simply understanding what is the niche that we as humans need. What are our needs? And top of that list for me is our light environment. And although people realize and they can touch and see the fake food on the middle aisles of the supermarket, people are less aware that essentially after the late 1800s, the world that we existed in as Homo sapiens and as organisms for 3-4 billion years changed radically, because we were able to illuminate the nighttime. And this cycle, this symmetrical and balanced cycle, this yin and yang of light at during the day, full spectrum light sun during the day, and complete darkness during night, with only waning and waxing moonlight. That cycle was broken because now we were illuminating the nighttime, and people were living indoors, covering their skin and sometimes their eyes from the not only the brightness or the intensity of light, but also the wavelengths of light that they were evolved with. So that I think is kind of where I'm at the moment, which is advocating for people to understand that correcting their light environment and eating a seasonal diet, which for the most part is going to be anchored in animal meat, animal fat, and the last for the 80%. And you can argue till we go blue with Dr. Saldino or Dr. Baker about whether that last 20% should include fruit, honey, fermented foods. To me, that's arguing over it's not really relevant. The main point is that we're agreeing that ruminant animal meat should be the basis of our diet, and but really mean to focus on the big picture here, which is what is our light environment, and how is that influencing the degree to which we need to stick on strict carnivore. And I really think the circadian effect of gut regulation and gut cell turnover and intestinal permeability is the kind of elephant in the room of the strict carnivore space. But it's all that's where I'm at the moment, and I think people are really enjoying and finding value in understanding the effect of light on health, and finding some amazing benefits of implementing these circadian and light protocols.
Yeah, fantastic. There's so much to pull apart there. I think the ancestral evolutionary lens is so important, and that's a big component that we talk about here, because in medicine, most of the other major sciences have a very solid foundation that is a hard science, right? Physics, mathematics, everything else. But in biology or in medicine, we seem to not have that solid framework. And I feel like evolutionary perspectives, and evolutionary biology is that foundation, but we've not really adapted that much. And when you look through that lens of evolution, then it really shapes what we should be doing for human health. And it's funny because we apply these concepts in, veterinary sciences and in zoos. For most other animals, we consider what is the environment they came from, and then how do we mimic that so that they have good health. And if they have poor health, we usually try to revert them back to their normal environment, normal food. But for some reason with humans, we've not applied that perspective, which I always find there seems to be some discordance there. And perhaps it's because of the medical training at the moment, whether there's alternative views that people just maybe don't buy into evolution yet, or it hasn't really broached its concepts widely into medicine. But it creates a very clear paradigm of then discerning, all right, what are the proximate root causes that are potentially problematic, and then how do we address those by returning to our ancestral past. And as you said, light, food, there's a lot of components where it really illuminates where the problem is in the modern day, that we can make very tangible changes to drastically shift health. But it seems not everyone in medicine and in health overall really goes down that path. And it's often where practitioners like yourself, they have to have had their own issues and their own journey to really open up the doors and go there. And I've had the same thing for myself. I dealt with IBS and gut issues and a whole host of things. So it seems you have to have that journey to be able to go down that path. There's certainly, when we look overall now, we have the diseases of affluence and all the non-communicable diseases that seem to be growing more and more. We've talked on a lot of concepts where it seems to be there's quite a few causes. Obviously, there's the light side, but I'd like to talk about some of the nutrition components and where perhaps we've gone wrong. Offline, we talked a little bit about where the food guidelines came from and how that shaped a lot of the general guidelines, and perhaps where there's been some let's say maybe fraud or things like that have drastically changed where we should have gone with food. So if you could share a little bit about that, because I know you and even Anthony Shafee have really talked about where we went wrong when we started to bring in the food guidelines.
Yeah, of course. And the framework to think about this is conflicts of interest. And when you mentioned this current approach to conventional mainstream medicine, the same concept applies. And when there's usually financial interests involved, then I think those economic and financial interests get looked after with respect to the writing and the shaping of treatment guidelines at the expense of simple common sense and logic, which, as you you obviously pointed out, that we have no problem in applying to the veterinary world when it comes to feeding exotic animals their correct diet. But the way I think about chronic disease is that it's fundamentally a mitochondrial issue, and these non-communicable diseases are diseases of what Dr. Doug Wallace calls mitochondrial bioenergetic failure. And what that essentially means is that the mitochondria, which make energy in the cell, they essentially take energy in the form of food, electrons, light, and they essentially transform that into energy for the cell, and they make water. But when you have up to 1,000 of these in every cell, and things like the heart and the brain have more mitochondria than others. But when there's failure of those mitochondria in the cell, then the cell's ability to do its job starts flagging. And I give the analogy of a brownout. So it's like when the load on the electricity grid rises and there's insufficient electricity to power everything, rather than going off, your lights just dim. So they just stop working. They're not completely broken, but their output is lowered. So that essentially happens. And if you live an ancestrally inappropriate diet and lifestyle and light environment over a period of decades, then you essentially will get heart failure, dementia, stroke, metabolic disease, chronic kidney disease, autoimmune disease, anxiety, depression, just depending on which organ it basically has this mitochondrial failure first. So to preview that and to go back to this idea of dietary conflicts of interest, is that the introduction of refined foods essentially deuterium-rich foods. And I'll quickly make the point of deuterium so that people know what we're talking about.
Yeah, I was gonna
Essentially,
say that.
yeah, it's essentially a heavy hydrogen isotope, and this is the reason why it's a problem is because inside the mitochondria, your body is your mitochondria was evolved to essentially pump these protons or these hydrogens up against a gradient and make essentially an electrochemical battery function by using the energy from electrons to pump these hydrogens against a gradient and then flow them back down and use that to drive this very incredibly elegant nanomotor called the ATPase. If you use a deuterium, which is a naturally occurring uh, isotope of hydrogen instead of the hydrogen, then it basically breaks that process and you get mitochondrial dysfunction and you get sick. And so the disease that I just mentioned. The problem here is that the foods that we're about to talk about, the refined seed oils, the sugar, and the refined carbohydrates, um, both inherently in the way that they're cultivated and in their refining process, are essentially enriched in deuterium relative to animal-based foods, animal-based fats like tallow, like butter. So the way that they interfere with the mitochondrial function is it basically is it's undesirable. So what happened all the way back in it goes as far back as the late 1800s and perhaps even earlier with the kind of beginning to refining of sugar. But the point that I think that it started to become a massive problem was the Seventh Day Adventists, who are a religious sect. They're a Protestant or a Protestant out branching. They were called the Millerites originally, or that was the kind of overall movement in the US. And they had these doomsday prophecies about the coming of Christ, and essentially had these very very wide kind of guilt associations about if we acted in a certain way, then it would prevent the coming of Christ. So one particular basically prophetess called Ellen White, who believed that if we ate animal foods like animal meat, steak, eggs, um, anything of animal origin, then that would cause people to pleasure themselves, and that self pollution would prevent the coming of Christ. So she she commenced a religious crusade, like an ideologically driven crusade to stop people from eating animal products, because what she thought was a Garden of Eden diet that was mainly nuts, grains, seeds, legumes, cereals, was essentially going to temper everyone's passions and therefore ensure religious salvation of not only and it wasn't only affecting them. So they weren't only pushing veganism and vegetarianism on their own adherents, but it was to do with everyone else. Everyone else got swept up into this movement. So whether we've liked it or not. And one of her disciples was John Harvey Kellogg, who later founded this Kellogg cereal company. And this religious view of theirs was the impetus behind the development of cornflakes that were supposed to be low in sugar originally and very bland, behind the development or the promotion of soy and animal replacements in the form of soy. So these people essentially masterminded the vegetarian and vegan movement in the USA, and in the 1920s even formed a dietary association that was supposedly the American Dietetics Association, was essentially a front group for Adventists. And just now, as corporations make organizations like astroturfing organizations to pretend like the Energy Balance Coalition, it just as that those exist today with corporations. What they did was form the Dietetics Association, but it was essentially a front for pushing their religious agenda on everyone. So that is how, and through the process or development of those religious ideas into a food industry, they kind of melded religion and profit, and that kind of continued to build all the way through the 20th century. And again, it was just emphasized that we needed to be eating a vegan or vegetarian diet. The problem where it really came to a head was when the food industry and the religious groups that had already kind of building momentum got involved with, or essentially found themselves as useful kind of comrades in the battle against heart disease. Because Ansel Keys was this physiologist who was he was intellectually fixated on the idea that it was dietary fat that, by its effect on cholesterol, was causing heart attacks, acute myocardial infarction, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And he got the call up to, or he essentially opportunistically jumped on the event, which was the president of the US's heart attack in, I believe it was 1955, and he basically drummed up support or convinced people that it was the dietary fat that was the problem. And the way he did this was through a very poor quality associational study called the 7-country study. And there was a lot of maneuvering, and there was a lot of data massaging. There was a lot of cherry picking of data. All these very, very unrigorous, poor, basically poor research practices. And so he pushed this idea that it was the dietary fat, which then got enshrined in the American Heart Association's policies, which were to replace saturated animal fats, or animal fats which were predominantly saturated, with polyunsaturated oils. That became their policy in the early 1960s. And the undisclosed conflict of interest there was that they took funding from Procter and Gamble, who was the company who had initially repurposed cotton seeds, which was again an industrial waste product, repurposed that as vegetable shortening, which again was a fancy marketing to convince housewives that pork lard was dirty, unclean, and therefore preferable to use these essentially refined oils because they were more clean. And I believe they had very, very good uptake amongst the Jewish housewives of New York, because they played on their religious interests or proclivities to maintain kosher and all this kind of thing. So it's interesting how religion gets very, very, very much involved.
Often.
But so what happened is, in the late 1960s, these were all the groups that were kind of it was an alliance. It's an alliance of different groups who are all piling onto animal foods. And animal foods, again, to reiterate, was what we've been eating since we became essentially these upright walking primates. And it was this alliance of convenience to demonize these animal fat. It gets even worse. And what happened around in the early 1970s was that the US essentially economically defaulted, and this was called the it was the closing of the gold window. Essentially, President Nixon stopped
the gold standard.
Yeah, he came off the gold standard. He stopped redemption. There was still kind of a residual ability of the currency to be redeemed for gold, but he removed the last gold backing. And this point in history was when in that country the inflation rate rose massively, and rather than admit to the people that the foods that were most nutritious for them were going up in price because they were scarce. It takes effort. It takes work to raise a cow for 3 years to produce nutrient-dense animal foods. So naturally, if you increase the number of money units in the system by simply printing money instead of remaining a gold backing, then anything that's scarce is going to become more expensive. So instead of admitting to the people that their most nutritious animal foods are now 40-50% more expensive, they simply attempted to engineer their food supply to subsidize very, very cheap commodity crops like corn and soy particularly, and put forth ridiculous edicts like eggs were going to kill you and cause all kinds of health problems. So it's fascinating because that is like simply another facet or another interest, the economic and essentially US government interest to attack animal foods. And they got together in the McGovern Report of 1977. That was the first dietary guidelines for the US for Americans that specifically essentially recommended this Garden of Eden Adventist diet. Was written by an Adventist staffer. The reason why that is relevant to us in Australia and people around the world is because the subsequent iterations of the dietary guidelines in the US were the unashamed, openly admitted guideline or template for our Australian dietary guidelines. And that was, I believe, I can't remember his name exactly, but the gentleman who instituted our Australian dietary guidelines admitted that he was an Adventist. He was either a vegetarian or he had close ties to those groups. So what we're left with in 2024 still is a Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, which is a legacy document of the essentially late 1800s Garden of Eden, vegan and vegetarian prescription by the Seventh-day Adventist religious group to reduce passion, sexual function, libido, which it does effectively because it is, low in fat soluble vitamins, cholesterol, carnitine, everything that is promoting a healthy libido. So what people don't realize is that when they're eating their Wheat Bix for breakfast, or they're eating cornflakes, when they're having toast in their breakfast, and they're eating all these serves of whole grains, that is not what was the norm prior to the influence of these religious groups, this diet heart hypothesis, cholesterol hypothesis, before the influence of the food companies, the monocropping industry that rose in the wake of that 1971 economic event. So all these groups came together and, again, by convenience, pushed a low meat based diet. And we, the people, are kind of left now with the consequence, which is reduce your red meat, reduce your saturated fat, reduce animal sources of cholesterol, and eat more soy, eat more whole grains, eat more vegetables. The other final interest that I'll quickly make mention of, because it's becoming more and more relevant now, and it's a sensitive topic these days, but you also have in the narratives around about climate, weather, and they are in the same way that Ansel Keys's proposal was not conducted with the most rigorous science. There are inconsistencies and selective reporting and just very, very convenient portrayal of the scientific method to push an agenda that conveniently also jumps onto the doggy pile of animal foods. And you don't have to dig too deeply intellectually. And when you think about the number of grazing ruminant herbivores prior to the onset of the event that is kind of being blamed, to realize that it's not really making a significant difference, and especially when those animals are regeneratively grazed. So it wouldn't be that's a brief overview of the history as I think about it. And look, it wouldn't be so significant if it weren't so damaging. And so damaging in that there's patients that I've seen who sit in front of me, they've eaten the high carb, low fat, seed oil diet that they were told to eat for their whole life, and then now they've got type 2 diabetes. Now they just had an acute myocardial infarction. Yeah, now they've got peripheral vascular disease. And yes, their light environment is incorrect, but or could be improved, but they are dealing with the consequences of advice that they were given, and they trusted an organization to represent their best interests, and they got led down the garden path. So where we're at is essentially you and I, people like us, are talking about what we believe and what seems to be borne out in both anthropological evidence and empirical clinical practice, which is that when you put people back on a animal-based, high animal fat, higher protein diet, then their metabolic problems disappear. And the problems that they essentially developed on these prescribed animal, high vegetable, high seed oil, high carb diet, they go away when you simply reverse that dietary paradigm. And compare the menu. Every once in a while, someone posts on social media a menu from the early 1900s, before this whole thing blew up, or before these interests kind of got entrenched in society. And there's 3 dishes, and every single one of them is some form of animal products. It's a quail entree, followed by a plate of oysters, followed by a eye fillet. That's what
Yeah.
it is. So there's nothing odd or unusual about eating an animal food rich diet. It was the norm. And Dr. Anthony Chaffee is the best person to who describes this the most eloquently. But I'm very much agreeing with him that it's normal to be eating an animal food rich diet, and it's highly abnormal to base your diet solely on these plant products, especially if they're highly refined, especially if they're doused in glyphosate or other form of contaminated industrial herbicide from this Roundup Ready process, which is more of a problem in the US, but still an issue here in Australia. So that is how I think about it at a high level view.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, so much to pick apart there. And I think a lot of people, it's human nature to be very short-sighted. I think we forget very easily what life was like, a generation ago. We're kind of always focused on our life experience, but we don't have to look back very far to look at what even just our grandparents ate, right? The staple of food was always animal based. That was always the prized food. That included nose to tail eating. We usually ate a range of offal and organs and everything else, and nothing went to waste. And that was the standard. But in a very short time period, people have forgotten that. And we seem to have been, you could say, brainwashed now into this idea of post sort of Neolithic era, where now industrial monocrop agriculture has become the norm, which for millions of years was not the norm at all. And it's always difficult. I find it hard not to be somewhat pessimistic sometimes, even though I try to be optimistic, to look at the discordance there, because it's very clear that there's been quite a marked and steep increase in chronic degenerative disease since pretty much the inclusion of the food guidelines. And there seems to be a very clear path forward to improve the health of the population through a more ancestral animal-based approach. But yet we still seem to be fighting quite an uphill battle, and it seems to be still a grassroots movement of trying to, I guess, awaken the rest of the population to this method of eating and approaching life overall, which I find unfortunate. But I think over time, more and more people will be spreading this message. And as you said at the beginning, I think the decentralized health movement, as I know you like to say, is great. So podcasts, courses, content that is easily scalable now that we can get out to the masses. I think that's going to be a really important component of pushing this message forward, because we can then get this across to hundreds of thousands, millions of people in an instant, whereas they're not reliant on the systems and a lot of the, I guess, regulated bodies for sort of fine tuning what message they want to get out. And we can just share what science is bringing forward and eventually find a point of truth, which is great. It sounds like I want to finish a little bit on the food side so we can get into some of the sleep and circadian biology, but it sounds like from your perspective, this overly carbohydrate dense processed carbohydrate diet, the primary issue with that is the high deuterium content. Is that right?
Well, I think that it's the constellation of things. I think from a food point of view, the deuterium content, but also the lipid peroxidation products in the seed oils, is what is the chief driver of mitochondrial, basically inefficiency or mitochondrial issues. And then you simply adding fuel to the fire in the form of these high carb foods. And Dr. Laszlo Boros is a really great person to talk about this, because he essentially describes it as a food. It's an inefficiency problem. It's a mitochondrial engine problem, and you get what essentially is an unburnt substrate. This accumulation of unburnt substrate in the engine, and that basically turns up as ectopic fat, visceral fat, all over the place. But I think that it's a constellation of factors of which the carbs and the seed oils are both playing a part. The reason why I bring up deuterium is because if you've seen Dr. Kenobi's work, Dr. Chris Kenobi, he gives the very interesting observation that ancestral people were living their ancestral lifestyle, the Catawans and the Papua New Guineans. The Papua New Guineans eat a diet that is 96% carbohydrate and something like 3% protein and 1% fat, because they're essentially harvesting a whole bunch of these yams or sweet potato tubers, exactly, and they have no metabolic disease. So one interpretation of it is that carbohydrate are insufficient on their own to cause metabolic dysfunction. Another interpretation is that their lifestyle is enabling them to essentially mitigate the fact that they're eating this high carb and probably deuterium loaded diet. And I think it's a bit of both, but the way to 100% develop metabolic disease is to eat the high deuterium diet in the form of the seed oils, but also the carbs, under blue light, out of season, and not be grounded, not get sufficient solar, UV sun and UV light, and all the other natural light wavelengths. So I think online and in the online world, there's a lot of arguing back and forth about, which is the factor that, is it the fructose, is it the refined fructose, is it the refined seed oils? I think the constellation of them together, and for different people, certain individual products might be more problematic, but they all get solved when we adopt hyper local eating of a predominantly animal based food pyramid, with plenty of sunlight, and no processed food.
Yeah, fantastic. I think there's definitely a lot of negative effects of a excessively processed, high carbohydrate, high seed oil diet. So I would agree. I think the constellation of issues, somewhat of a perfect storm, especially when tied together with a highly unnatural environment between light, grounding, just everything in that perspective, sets people up for poor health. It's not always, written in stone. I think the genetic determinism type of approach to things has its downfalls as well. But it's certainly an area where, if we can just align our health a little bit more naturally, I think a lot of people will be doing a lot better. I think that it's a nice segue then into the circadian biology and the sleep perspective, because now I think it's becoming much more popular and much more mainstream as far as the importance for sleep. It used to be, I'll sleep when I'm dead. And there's still some people out there that maybe push that. But I think even in the high performance space, high striving entrepreneurs, athletes, they're all becoming more aware of the importance of sleep. And then obviously that's also trickling down. And just for general health, sleep is becoming more and more important. And a lot of that comes down to circadian biology and regulation of circadian rhythm. And I think we can start with that and maybe broach that topic a little bit more for people who are not super familiar with circadian biology and how that influences things. And then I'd love to talk about how our body regulates some of those processes between central clocks, peripheral clocks, melanopsin, melatonin. There's quite a few things that I know you spent a lot of time digging into that I think would be very valuable for people to learn more about.
Yeah, for sure. So essentially, the circadian rhythm is an internal timing mechanism that not only humans, but essentially all animals have evolved. The problem that circadian timing solves is one of changing environmental conditions. So if you imagine that the Earth is rotating, orbiting the sun, and not only do we have changing day length depending on the season, but we also have essentially over that seasonal, we've got a massive variation. So we've got light and dark during a 24-hour cycle, but we've also got this 365 variation in light and temperature depending on your latitude. So the circadian rhythm is a way of the body timing everything that's going on in its body and getting inputs from the environment to make sure that the fidelity or the precision of that timing mechanism is accurate. So the circadian rhythm is essentially a 24-hour clock that runs inside us, and there's a part of the brain that lives in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the master clock or the master coordinator of that timing mechanism, and it has to receive signals from the environment, predominantly from light, and that light signals enter from the eye along a very special tract that is designed specifically to carry light information. The value of this is that the organism can then adapt, so it can adapt and anticipate not only behavior but also hormonal processes. So just and again, I think the way to think about this is Mother Nature never makes mistakes. Mother Nature is looking for efficiency in everything it does. And if you've ever looked at what Charles Darwin kind of described when he was, went to the Galapagos Islands, the presence of these different types of birds and their big shape was incredibly finely tuned to this specific niche that they occupied. The way to think about circadian biology is it's a way of Mother Nature to give us the most efficient system to basically deal with the environment that we exist in. So what that means is that we need these environmental signals. Again, the predominant one is light, and it influences things. So if you imagine in the day, we need to collect food, we need to become active, we need to reproduce, and there's times where that is more optimal to do that. And based on, again, our evolution, we're a diurnal creature. We are operating during the day, so it's best to hunt during the day, to eat during the day, to be socially active during the day, and then during the night we sleep. We initiate all those cellular repair processes that people might know of, like autophagy and apoptosis. And so that is it's the specialization and the coordination of the right behavior, the right hormonal pathway, the right cellular program at the right time. And another example of how that is expressed is, say, in a hibernating mammal, they need to know that it's the right time to go into a hole and sleep for a couple months. And the way they sense that is by changing day length, the angle of the light into the eye, the temperature drop. These are all being sensed in real time and fed into a system that then dictates the thyroid hormone concentration. It dictates the cold thermogenesis, or the amount of heat that the body's making. If you don't have those signals, then there's confusion and there's chaos in the system, and that's inefficiency, and that essentially derails the whole program, and you get things like metabolic disease, and you get mitochondrial dysfunction, inefficiency, and you get things like obesity and type 2 diabetes. So it's an energy problem. It's an information gathering problem. That's what circadian biology is kind of solving. What that essentially means for us today is that we need to respect the fact that despite the fact that we've engineered our environment, we still have ancestral needs when it comes to our light environment, our temperature environment. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's a system that's very much reliant, and I invite people to think about the yin and yang symbol. So there's a symmetrical balance of dark and light, and that implies that your circadian needs are bright sunlight during the day from the sun, not from artificial light, and complete absence of dark during the night. So if you can mess that system up in a couple of ways. One, by getting insufficient bright sunlight, full spectrum sunlight during the day, but you can also mess it up by getting light at night. And that when you break that coupled system, things go wrong. And the effect is, again, to derail the function of your mitochondria, because they are inherently reliant on signals like melatonin that get made from the pineal gland on the absence of blue wavelength light sensed through the eye in order to kick off the healing process and the nocturnal process in all your organs. So what we have done, and this is a function of having this massive brain and the ability to reason and engineer our environment, is that we're able to, so to speak, break Mother Nature's laws. The bear, the bird, they don't have an option. They're going to respect their circadian biology because they don't have any higher cognitive function to build a light bulb or develop an iPad. But that is where we're at, in the fact that we've invented these alien suns, and these alien suns are tools that we are convenient and they're useful, but they're also ways for us to throw a spanner in the works of our circadian biology. So the way I think about it today is that everyone has a challenge, which is to understand this light facet of the ancestral niche that we talked about earlier, and as much as possible respect your needs when it comes to your light environment and the circadian signals that you're sending your body. And if you don't do that, and again, I like to say it's a tough life, but your circadian biology doesn't care that you have to work shift work. It doesn't care about anything like that. It has specific needs, and if you don't respect those needs, you're going to get sick. And the kind of convergence of the diet, the light diet, the food diet, is in mitochondrial dysfunction, and that again manifests as bioenergetic failure and chronic diseases that we've talked about earlier.
Fantastic. It all ties into that evolutionary ancestral approach, and the circadian rhythms, as far as evolutionary conservation, like that is highly, highly conserved across species, across many even simple organisms. So it's something that, because we're on planet Earth, we've basically been programmed since we were simple-celled organisms, and it's such an important role because, as you said, it influences our entire endocrine system. It influences our organs. Basically, our entire body is regulated by that circadian rhythm. So that's why it's such an important factor that I hope more and more people start to understand that role. An area that I've brought up, which I find really interesting, is this whole melanopsin, melatonin, POMC, leptin, and how it's influenced there. Could you kind of open that one up a little bit for people from a perspective of they probably don't have a biochemistry background? I think most people are familiar with melatonin and melanin, but there's a lot of other factors in the system and how it directly affects metabolism. Because for a lot of people, they maybe don't connect the dots. They think, well, okay, light affects these certain things. Maybe they understand a bit of the endocrinology perspective, but as far as metabolic regulation, there's obviously that tight connection to leptin and other areas. So I'd love to dive into that.
Yeah, it's a good question, and there are some technical words, so I'll try and explain them as clearly as I can. So melanopsin is a receptor. It's a blue light detector, and it was originally discovered in frogs, in these African clawed frogs, and it was an ability of them to simply detect blue wavelength light. So what we have evolved in our eye, and I alluded to this earlier, was an ability to sense the presence and absence of blue wavelength light. And this is separate from the eye's functionality as a camera. So the camera, it can form images by the rods and the cones, but it also senses. It has a detector function, which is the on and off of blue wavelength light. So when the eye receives these light signals in 470 nanometers approximately, then it triggers these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells in the eye to send a message all the way to that master clock in the hypothalamus along the retinohypothalamic tract. So melanopsin is a blue light detector. It's a non-visual photoreceptor. Again, alluding to this concept of you've got visual and non-visual photoreception. The reason why we evolved non-visual photoreceptor system is, again, it's about information gathering, and it's about informing the time of day to the cells, to these clock timing mechanisms. The interesting thing is that we also express melanopsin in our skin, which means that you can detect blue light through your skin and potentially disrupt your circadian rhythm and your circadian signals by exposing yourself to artificial light at night. And the key point here is that the artificial light at night, the LED, the compact fluorescent bulbs, the OLED, the iPad screens, these emit isolated blue light. And that is exactly the wrong type of light for a healthy circadian rhythm, because it is exactly the light that is triggering melanopsin. And if you expose yourself to this form of artificial light for long periods of time, you will damage your melanopsin receptors, and you will not only are you sending a confusing signal in the short term, but you're essentially damaging them over the long time through this isolated blue light, and that is a significant, in my opinion, contributor to things like age-related macular degeneration and retinal pathology. So that is melanopsin. It's a blue light detector. It's very highly conserved across evolution, originally found in claw frogs. But it's the reason why we need to wear things like blue light blocking glasses and cover up under artificial light, because it is a key sensor of the daytime. And it makes sense because the body essentially wants to collect as much information about the environment as it can. And if there's something like as important as blue light, which is a signal to get started with the day, to be active, then your body has these evolved mechanisms to sense it and do something about it. So that is melanopsin. It is a non-visual photoreceptor. There are other non-visual photoreceptors. There's a bunch of them. We don't necessarily need to go into them, but suffice to say, there are more ways, again, of collecting environmental information about ambient light and light wavelengths, which in turn imply time of day and get us that closer, more high fidelity signal and more to again program everything that's going on. So that's melanopsin. Melatonin is both an antioxidant and it's a nighttime signal. It was essentially a substance that evolved 2.4 billion years ago in Archaea, and it was being used by these very, very primitive organisms as an antioxidant. What that essentially means is that, and why it's relevant, that the melatonin is where it's being made. So melatonin has the effect to quench oxidative reactive oxygen species. So just imagine that you get spot fires all over a building. The melatonin is like the fire extinguisher going around and extinguishing these spot fires. It is very, very effective at doing that, and people might know about things like vitamin C as an antioxidant. The melatonin is basically the most effective antioxidant your body has evolved, and the reason why is because its metabolites are also very potent antioxidants. So it can quench oxidative stress very, very effectively. So melatonin is also a signal for darkness, and it is made in the pineal gland, which is a gland not far from your hypothalamus, though the signal takes a more roundabout route. But essentially, when your body no longer has a blue light daytime signal, then your pineal gland dumps melatonin into the circulation a couple of hours after the nightfall. That, again, is an endocrine signal of nighttime, so the body can start repairing and doing those cellular garbage cleaning effects. So that is one role. But what we're learning more and more is that, and this is the work of Scott Zimmerman, Russell Ryder, is that melatonin is not only being produced in the pineal gland, and in fact, the area that it's being produced most in is not in the pineal gland. So it is getting produced in a bunch of different compartments, essentially in all our cells on exposure to infrared light. And infrared light is one part of the spectrum of terrestrial electromagnetic radiation that we evolved with, but it's non-visible. So, around just over 50% of photons are non-visual infrared photons, and they're being discarded or ignored or sidelined by modern lighting engineers, by basically everyone who isn't aware of the effect of light on health. But it's a critical light nutrient that everyone is deficient in. The effect of infrared light is to generate melatonin in the mitochondria on site to deal with oxidative stress that's being generated in real time. And that makes sense because the electron transport chain in the mitochondria might sometimes leak, might sometimes have issues. Then it makes sense to have evolved an antioxidant that can be produced right there to quench that oxidative stress. Why is that important? Is because amongst a bunch of other functions, your mitochondrial DNA are existing very close to these, this site of potential inflammation, because it's a furnace, it's an oven, it's a reactor that's flying off all these oxidative reactive oxygen species. If you are deficient in infrared light, if you're not stimulating your body to make melatonin, you're going to mutate those mitochondrial DNA at a rate much faster than ancestrally would be the case. And therefore, you're going to get diseases like we talked about, the diseases of the West, quicker, because your mitochondria, those mutations, have consequences in terms of mitochondrial function, and then you get the brownout, and then you get disease. So these diseases are, in that way, can be understood as a light deficiency, specifically a deficiency of melatonin during the day, but also during the night. The other kind of areas that melatonin gets secreted is the gut. There's a massive repository or production of melatonin inside the gut, which is a result of the microbiome. So those are all those areas, and that is essentially what melatonin is doing. So you can think about melatonin as an antioxidant, as a signal of darkness, as the guardian of the mitochondrial DNA. It is this amazing substance, and we need to protect our mitochondria, our melatonin, as much as we can. We need to make sure that we're not deficient in melatonin by getting full spectrum sunlight during the day and absence of blue light during the night. So, i.e., respecting our circadian biology. So that's melatonin. People take melatonin to medicate the fact that their circadian rhythm is being disrupted through artificial light at night, through too much caffeine during the day, and which I believe is not appropriate, not ideal, and sometimes which is appropriate, which is to treat with circadian realignment post jet lag.
Yeah, I wanted to ask your opinion on that, because I know there's protocols for jet lag as far as in training the circadian rhythm, but there seems to be also a growing area in the integrative alternative health space of people doing very high dose melatonin, whether just for health optimization. I know there's some protocols now looking at cancer treatment. So curious, what's your perspective on exogenous use of melatonin?
So I think cancer is a completely different kettle of fish, and if it's being used in that situation, then that's not really a health optimizing topic. And if I believe there is some exciting data, and that makes sense, because cancer is a bioenergetic. It's a metabolic, as Dr. Thomas Seyfried calls it, a mitochondrial metabolic disease, but it's also a bioenergetic disease. So adding in something like high dose melatonin potentially could be beneficial, but that's a separate topic. I think it does potentially have value in short term use with something like shift work, I think, for sure. But that is a completely different thing than taking it every night, because you have to work. You're exposed to blue light at your office till 10 p.m. every night. So the nuance is the situation that it's being used in, the acute or the chronicity of its use. Those are all very relevant to answer your question.
Yeah, that's fair. And certainly very different scenarios.
Yeah, and then to fit in POMC and melanin. So essentially, the other part of the story is our response to light, or what substances or chemicals are we using, is our body using as part of our circadian biology to engineer or to have these effects on our endocrine system and our body function. So one of them is pro-opioid melanocortin, or POMC. This is, again, very ancient, 500-year-old gene that is it's a master peptide hormone, meaning that when it gets cut up, like, think about a long carnival ticket. Imagine a carnival ticket with different tickets inside that long ticket, and you're from Brisbane. If you cut it at one place, you can get into SeaWorld. If you cut it at another place, you can get into Movie World. If you cut it another place, you can get into the Big Pineapple, up in
Perfect.
Sunshine Coast. So depending on where you cut the ticket is going to influence the effect that it has in each tissue. And it's fundamentally a hormone or prohormone of light. And it's stimulated by ultraviolet light. So that is another clue to this requirement for a full spectrum of light nutrients during the day, because we've talked about infrared, visible light. We've talked about you do need amount of blue to kickstart the whole process of wakefulness, but you also need UV, and UV has a role in vitamin D production. It has a role in nitric oxide production, but it has a role critically in stimulating POMC. Why is POMC so important? Is because when you cut that long carnival ticket up in different places, it again has each one of those peptide hormones has a critical role in a specific organ and in a specific setting. One of those is beta endorphin. What that means is if you get in the sun, you get ultraviolet B light, your body, your skin makes POMC, it cuts POMC up into an opioid-like chemical. So if anyone's ever taken oxycodone, endone, codeine, any of those, I was going to say heroin, but I hope no one's taken heroin. Fentanyl, morphine. These are opioids. Morphine is opiate. The others are opioids. But essentially, your body has a endogenous system, a mechanism to respond in a way that rewards you, and it rewards you with these pleasant feelings of endorphins. One way to stimulate endorphin release, beta endorphin, is through getting ultraviolet light. That is why sunbathing is addictive, because nature is rewarding you for getting out into ultraviolet light. So that needs to be explained by anyone who is telling you to avoid ultraviolet light. Explain the physiology of POMC. Why are we having a very, very evolutionary conserved mechanism to make an endorphin? I mean, it's a very important question, and certain aspects of centralized science and medicine really need to answer that question if they're really going to give people accurate lifestyle advice. That's another whole separate topic. The other cleavage products of POMC that are relevant include alpha MSH, and there's a whole bunch of other MSHs that stands for melanocyte stimulating hormone. The melanocytes are the cells in your skin layer that make melanin, and melanin is a pigment that is very dark that absorbs ultraviolet and visible light and all forms of light. It's and if anyone has sat on a black yoga mat in the middle of the sun, or stood on a black tar road just after it's in the middle of summer, you can tell how warm and how hot that surface is. That is because the color black absorbs all this light energy, essentially. So melanin is doing the same, but in our skin. And the more pigmented the skin is, the greater ability to absorb electromagnetic radiation. What it does with that radiation is an interesting topic, but essentially it is protecting the cells from DNA damage, which ultraviolet light does do to the cells. So it's absorbing it and mitigating it as heat. And it's also using that light information to power the cells. And there's an energy generation process that involves splitting the water molecule, and it gets quite complicated. But there's a way that the body's also generating or deriving energy from sunlight by harnessing and using melanin. So melanin is something that is beneficial. It is something that also has properties such as heavy metal chelation. So it is thought that the evolution of pigment or dark hair, in particularly, I believe it was just in East Asia, was an ability to excrete heavy metals, because the melanin has a very, very high affinity and ability to chelate metals. So that is one function. It's, again, very highly conserved. There's basically fungi or other form of primitive organisms that have found a way to absorb radioactive decay, so radioactive particles, and by using a melanin to harness that. This is in Chernobyl.
Amazing.
Yeah, for energy. So that is melanin. It's very important. Obviously, people of equatorial origin and descent have genetically have greater expression of melanin in their skin, which enables them to protect them from the higher UV yield. It also means that it becomes more difficult for them to make vitamin D, and why it's problematic to be mismatched between your latitude and your skin type, especially if you're darker in a high latitude area. But that is melanin, and it gets synthesized by a POMC cleavage product. The other, and I hope people are still following, is that fascinating implication of this alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone is in the control of appetite. So what it does is that although it's darkening the skin in the brain, in the skin, when it's secreted in the brain, it is regulating and suppressing appetite. So you can just imagine that if you're sitting indoors all day, you're maybe wearing sunglasses, you're blocking your body from getting UV light into the eye and the skin, that you are not giving your body a key satiety hormone that's going to tell you that it's full, that your body's full, and therefore you're going to overeat. So not only are you're lacking in beta endorphin, so you're not feeling satisfied or content, you're also lacking that satiety signal. So that is the intersection between our light environment and essentially our energy metabolism center, because the hypothalamus, where that suprachiasmatic nucleus exists, is also integrating these environmental signals like temperature to regulate body temperature, hunger, all these very, very critical functions. But it essentially is bringing in that information and then regulating it that way. You asked about leptin. So leptin is another peptide hormone that's secreted by your fat cells, and that is essentially in a way of accounting for the total energy store of the body. And leptin is docking to the hypothalamus and to POMC expressing neurons to inform the central operating system, or the central coordinating mechanism of the peripheral signals of energy storage and energy function, essentially. So if we're leptin resistant, which is a lot of people are these days, and people who develop insulin resistance and have metabolic syndrome are by definition leptin resistant. And if they are leptin resistant, then that's one contributing factor is a distorted light environment and a distorted circadian rhythm, because leptin is fundamentally a circadian hormone. The other intersections of light and metabolism also relate to melatonin and the timing of light signals, and leptin interacts with melatonin interacts with the leptin receptor to again influence the degree to which the coordination of the timing of nutrients relative to time of day. So the way to think about, or kind of what are the actionable steps of that information, is that if you want to become metabolically healthy, if you want to become thin in a healthy way and not obese, then you need to synchronize your body with its external environmental signals to feed into that leptin melanocortin pathway the correct information, so your body knows how much energy it has on board, how much energy is in the environment that it's, say, deriving from its UV light exposure, and essentially integrating everything so that the body knows what the F is going on. And you screw that up by looking at your phone at night, by staying indoors, by not getting any full spectrum sunlight, by illuminating your bedroom with blue light. Those are all ways of screwing it up. And that is why I believe the light story takes precedence over the food story, because as I've previously said, you just like there's junk food, there's junk light, and you can't out eat a junk light diet, no matter what the quality of your food, and for the reasons that I've just talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we have very good evidence showing that disrupted sleep and insomnia increase the amount of food consumed when people are left to consume ad libitum. So when there's no control of diet, there's the ward studies where they can control that. But if they just let people eat, we see very clearly that they tend to overeat and have poor food choices when they have disrupted sleep. So yeah, I would agree that I think if your circadian biology and your sleep is not narrowed in, then it's going to create a cascade of negative effects that are going to throw off everything else. So you kind of have to address that first if you want to improve everything else in your life.
Definitely, mate. Well summarized.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'm sure I could pick your brain quite a bit. I know there was a few other topics I wanted to dive into with you. We're already past an hour, so I'll be mindful of your time. And maybe in a future one, I'd love to talk to you more about regenerative agriculture, farming, decentralized food, and supporting food sovereignty, because that's another big part of our mission here and something that we're very passionate about. So maybe we'll have to have you back on another talk. But I think that's a great closing. So it gives people very actionable steps as far as what they need to do to manage their light environment and make sure that their light environment is solid. And then from a food perspective, obviously we talked about avoiding excessively processed foods between carbohydrates and seed oils, and try to transition more to an animal-based ancestral diet. So I think if people do that, for the most part, a lot of their general issues, the items that you said at the beginning that most people are dealing with that are somewhat common but shouldn't necessarily be normal, I think a lot of them would be resolved if people address those issues.
Definitely. I think that's great advice. And I tell people look after your food diet, but look after your light diet and make sure that you are sending yourself those appropriate, correct local signals, whether that's local food or local light. So happy to come on again and talk about farming. But thanks for the conversation.
Oh, my pleasure. And I know you've got your Regenerate Health Summit coming up. This should go live before that comes out. So if you wanted to share a little bit about that and where people can maybe find you if they want to work with you. I know you also have an online course on light and circadian biology as well.
Yeah, so we're hosting an event on April the 21st in Melbourne, Victoria, and it is a synthesis of a lot of the ideas that I've talked about on this podcast. So the pillars are circadian biology, ancestral and carnivore type diets, and regenerative farming. And that trio is what I believe is how we get back on track individually and collectively from a health point of view. So tickets are selling fast. It would be great to see you there. I'm speaking. Dr. Anthony Chafee is speaking. Dr. Pran Yoganathan is speaking. Dr. Jalal Khan, circadian quantum health expert, is speaking. So is Natalie West, a carnivore psychotherapist, and Charlie Arnott. So it's going to be an amazing day. We have a massive barbecue organized. There's going to be a lot of fantastic connection and learning and discussion. So go to regenerateoz.com or just follow my links for that information. And you can find my work. I've got my podcast is called Regenerative Health. It's on YouTube. It's on the podcast streaming platforms, and my website, Dr. Max Gulhane. I've got a circadian reset course, which basically goes through the basics of everything we've talked about. And I'm soon to be releasing a solar callus course, which is going to be explaining how to get sun exposure, get deliberate sun exposure in a way that is respecting our circadian biology and essentially aligning everything that we've talked about and harnessing the benefits by deliberate, safe sun exposure. So, and that's coming soon. So stay tuned, but I will give you the links. You can share them with your audience. And anyone who wants to ask me questions, I've got a private group. So I do a weekly Q&A for my members. So if you're interested in asking me specific questions about your situation or how to apply these concepts to your daily life, then join up. It's on the school platform. Again, the links are in my link tree. And it'd be great to meet you and we can help you out and work through this process together.
Fantastic. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of nuance and things to work on for a lot of people. So it's great to share that. And I'll, of course, put that in the show notes for anyone that wants to connect with you.
Great.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Max. I look forward to chatting with you again very, very soon.
Thanks, mate. See ya.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes. And if you're looking to add in nature's most nutrient-dense foods back into your diet, be sure to check out vitalorigin.com.au and use coupon SOURCE10 at checkout for an extra 10% off. We'll see you guys on the next episode.